Welcome to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy. Spider-Man No Way Home featured the return of classic Spider-Man villains such as Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, Alfred Molina's Doc Ock, Jamie Foxx's Electro, the Lizard, kind of, Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman, kind of. We learn in the film that these are the exact same villains from the films that we've seen before. These characters are individually plucked from different moments in their universe's timeline. Now, we'd previously speculated that the villains in the film could be variants of the characters that we've met before. Variants meaning multiversal versions of the characters that share many similarities but also some differences. And one of the key reasons we thought this was because of Electro's shocking change in appearance, as well as the return of Doc Ock's maze-shattered sunglasses and new sweater. #Sweatergate. Anyway, in No Way Home, we see Peter, of course, wanting to cure these villains before sending them back home to hopefully prevent them from dying at the hands of their own Spider-Man. The question is, what are these villains' new fates after receiving their respective cures? We'll start by discussing where they were taken from in their timelines, when they are sent back, and what can change. We'll also be discussing what those changes mean for the futures of their respective universes. Let's start with Sandman, Flint Marco. In No Way Home, we first see Sandman when he shows up to help Peter take down Electro. He says, "Peter, it's me, Flint Marco," which shows that this is a Sandman after the events of Spider-Man 3, a redeemed Flint Marco. A Flint Marco who just wants to get back home to his daughter.
I just want my kids back.
A Flint Marco that for some reason chooses to remain in his sand form for the entirety of the movie until he's cured. Now, if you'll remember, Flint didn't do this in Spider-Man 3. He often took on his human form, but in No Way Home, he is a sand-like being even when he's doing something as simple as sitting on a couch in Happy's apartment. Now, this makes me wonder what's going on with Flint in his timeline that he's staying in his sand form. Is he slowly losing his ability to return to human form? Is he becoming more sand than human? Is his character on a path to eventually never being able to return to his human form again? Or is he simply keeping his guard up in the MCU because he feels threatened and his sand form makes him feel safer? And of course, the real reason is because they probably couldn't get Thomas Hayden Church to physically play the character again. He did do the voice acting, but he not once physically appears in the film. Even the shot at the end of the movie when he's cured is taken directly from this scene in Spider-Man 3. Now, what will happen to Flint once he returns to the Raimiverse? Well, it's looking like he maybe could have had a pretty happy ending. Fully returned to his human form, no longer burdened with his sand power, and able to reconnect with his daughter. Now, granted, he is likely still a wanted man, and not having his sand powers will make it harder to run from the law. Perhaps he'll turn himself in, serve his time, and be able to have a normal life with his daughter. Maybe his friend Spider-Man could even put in a good word for him. And maybe he will return to the present, so he won't create a splintered timeline, and he'll fit right back in. But more on those splintered timelines in a minute. Now let's get into Electro. Electro says the last thing he remembers is whooping Spider-Man's ass until Spider-Man caused an overload which made Electro get stuck in the grid. He was then absorbing data and able to turn into pure energy, and then he realizes that he's about to die, and we all saw this in Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now we've wondered how Electro was even brought into the MCU via the spell, since he never learned Spider-Man was Peter Parker. That's never really explained, nor is his new appearance, which is only briefly mentioned by Lizard, but I feel like his one line about absorbing data is the answer to how Electro knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Remember the man in the hat?
I've identified several worthy candidates.
That's the guy we saw in the post-credits of both Amazing Spider-Man films. He was working with Oscorp to form what would eventually become known as the Sinister Six. This guy would have known that Peter Parker was Spider-Man.
Did you tell the boy the truth about his father?
And that information is likely stored in the secret Oscorp computer that Harry Osborn was just starting to access. Harry didn't know that Peter was Spider-Man until he pieced it together himself after seeing Gwen at the energy grid. But since the gentleman knew the secret, then that information was stored deep in the top secret servers of Oscorp. Electro accessed those files, thus he was plucked from the moment that he found out Peter Parker was Spider-Man, similar to Doc Ock and likely the Lizard. And as far as his body looking different, I guess you could say that when he gets his body back, like he says in No Way Home, perhaps it's slightly changed, like he creates the body for himself that he actually wanted. As for Max's fate, we think that when he pops back into his universe, he just lands on the ground at the electric grid and can move on with his life. Maybe he gets a little jail time for the destruction he's caused and for killing a few people.
Unworthy, defective urch freaks.
Next up, Doc Ock. Alfred Molina's return as Doc Ock was one of the best parts of this film. He jumped right back into his role after nearly 20 years, and it's like he never left. So in the film, we hear Ock say that he had Spider-Man by the throat, of course referencing this scene.
I won't.
It's in this moment that Doc Ock was ripped from his universe and brought to the MCU. But what happens when he's sent back? Well, probably the exact same thing that happened originally. Originally, that scene goes as follows. Peter reminds Ock about what he taught him about regarding intelligence being a gift, not a privilege. This convinces Otto to overcome his mechanical arms, release Peter, and go on to drown his fusion reactor in the river. Well, if Otto is sent back to that exact same moment, this time with his inhibitor chip being fixed, so he's still in control of his arms, he'd still release Peter. He'd still insist that it would be him to drown the fusion reactor, and he'd still likely die in the process. So, not much change there other than the fact that one of his arms will be missing because the Goblin cut it off. Now, this is of course all assuming that he's dropped back where he was taken from. Or is he dropped back in his universe hours later, marking the time that he's been in the MCU. It would also be interesting to see if Tobey is aware that Otto never left that moment in time. We saw what it looked like for Eddie Brock to be sent into the MCU. It was very chaotic, so I'm wondering if he's the only villain who experiences the flashing and loud noises, or if others can see it as well. I think it's safe to assume that when a character is plucked from their timeline, time still moves on in that universe without them, leaving their Spider-Man wondering where the hell the villain went. But I wonder, when Doc Ock is placed back in his timeline, does that erase the splintering timeline as if he never left? This would be similar to Bruce Banner and the Ancient Ones conversation regarding the removal and return of the Infinity Stones.
Without our chief weapon against the forces of darkness, our world would be overrun.
We can return each one to its own timeline at the moment it was taken. So, chronologically, in that reality, it never left.
But we think that each villain actually created 3 divergent timelines. Remember, every time the Avengers traveled back in time, they did create a Nexus event which created a new universe, even if it was only temporary, until Steve returned the stones. So that's one splinter, the one where the villains were taken away. So we have a splintered timeline where Dr. Octopus disappeared forever. Then there would be another splinter where that character returned and chose a new path. Then, of course, there would still be the original timeline for the previous films that we saw play out. And if you're wondering why the villain leaving didn't just change the past, well, Professor Hulk has an answer for us.
If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Alright, now for the Lizard. The Lizard was handled very similar to the Sandman. The actor was only brought in to voice the character, and the short glimpses that we get of him in No Way Home is reused footage from The Amazing Spider-Man. The Lizard was taken from this point.
Peter Parker.
In The Amazing Spider-Man's original timeline, Lizard returns to his Kurt Connors form and saves Peter from falling from Oscorp Tower, even though Peter can stick to walls. Then, from prison, he demands that the Gentleman/Gustav Fiers leave Peter alone. So maybe when Connors returns to his universe, he won't have killed anyone yet in his timeline, and he won't go to prison, or at least not for a really long time, thus creating a different splintered timeline. And now we've saved the best for last. Willem Dafoe's Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. We also have to take a second to once again talk about how incredible Dafoe was returning to this role 20 years later, and how he did an even better job than before, and that's saying a lot. He really embodied the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde parallels in Norman Osborn, and once again, it's unclear where Green Goblin was taken from in his timeline. All we know that it was after this.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that looks awful.
Oh, it's nothing.
I'll get the first aid kit. Then we'll say grace.
And before this.
Oh.
This has got to be the best of the New Fate scenarios. Norman Osborn gets to return to his timeline free from the rage of the Goblin, and he can live his life with his son Harry and use his brilliant mind for good.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
But this will also have ramifications for a version of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. Green Goblin was the first big villain, and the events that transpired in that film really shaped Tobey's Spider-Man and set up his constant conflict with himself regarding his love for Mary Jane but not wanting to put her in danger. So in this timeline, it's easy to imagine a scenario where Peter didn't reject Mary Jane, where in fact he said, hey, let's get together because her life was never threatened by the Goblin. And maybe in this timeline, this variant version of Peter had to suffer the death of Mary Jane, which of course would turn him into a much darker path, and a lot darker than we saw here. And before we go, we have to address Venom. We saw Tom Hardy's version of Venom pulled into the MCU as well. Now, he spent his time in the MCU at a Mexican hotel bar, which is honestly just perfect for this version of Eddie Brock and Venom. Many have asked why he would be pulled in, since he not only doesn't know Peter Parker as Spider-Man, but his world doesn't even seem to have a Spider-Man. Well, right before Eddie and Venom are taken from their universe into the MCU, Venom reveals that the symbionts have a hive mind of knowledge that spans throughout universes. So this means that Venom knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man because other versions of himself know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and that knowledge is shared across the multiverse. And the reason that Eddie was pulled in is because the symbiote just began pouring knowledge into Eddie's mind, and part of that knowledge is the knowledge that Peter is Spider-Man. Now, as for his fate, he'll likely just show back up in his original hotel room that he was taken from to begin with. And that's not even all the villains we saw in the film. But let me know if you have any questions about this down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.